Alright, let's talk about homework. We're going to take 20 minutes out of today's class to talk about homework. So hit me up with the ones that you had big questions about. Or is it all done?
Is there an intentional MBPS and MBPS? Is that megabytes and megabits? I wanted to make sure that I did convert it right.
Yes.
Is that intentional? Okay.
Yeah, so
There's a conversion there.
the 6 terabytes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
Because that would be a hard drive and there would be storage, so there's a conversion.
Okay.
So just to clarify that, when you're measuring storage, that is in powers of 2. So a terabyte would be 2 to the 40th bytes. Not bits, bytes. And then a terabit, for instance, would be 2 to the 12th, or 10 to the 12th bits, right? Anything else?
Is there a limitation on sample rate?
Huh?
Limitation on sample rate. So if you have a sample rate that's smaller than what could be possible on the line, is that a limitation?
So you have a sample rate that could be smaller. Which question were we referring to?
Question 3.
The noiseless channel?
One with noise on it.
The one with noise. So that one just you plug into Shannon.
Right, but the problem is that you have a sample rate of 1 millisecond.
Yeah.
And ignore that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Anything else?
I'm trying to pull up the questions right now. We're on the fourth one. I assume we're trying. When you say we're solving for the max signal noise ratio, that's just plugging in that you have the bits per second and speed, and then you plug that into the equation where you're solving.
So what was the question?
Yeah.
Wish to send one T1 carrier. Is that the one?
Yeah.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I assume that the T1 carrier, that's the speed in bits per second.
Yeah, I just gave it to you so you didn't have to look it up.
Okay, you're plugging that into the equation where you're doing the bits per second is equal to 2 times the bandwidth times the log of.
Yeah, so you have a 50 kilohertz line, so you have to figure out what the max.
And the signals ratio is what you're solving for in the log. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Do Shannon and Nyquist, is that how you say the guy's name?
Nyquist.
Nyquist, relate to each other?
Well, Shannon derived some of his work out of Nyquist as a basis, so they are related. But one is the theoretical maximum sampling rate, which is Nyquist, and Shannon showed that if you incorporate noise into that, then it's the theoretical maximum real world noise.
Because I noticed that, is it Nyquist has the 2B? And
Yeah.
Shannon has B.
That is correct.
Okay.
And I had that question earlier when I was working with another student, and that is the correct Shannon. So I'm going to go through and look on how it was derived. So.
Can you give us a general idea of where should we be looking to figure out the last one we were talking about setting uncompressed video signal, and then you figure out how much bandwidth is needed?
Uh-huh.
I didn't know where to start with that.
So what's so you have a screen, right? And how much data is in that screen?
Right, so you calculate how many bits, right?
Yeah, how many bits are in that screen, and then you're sending it at 60 times a second. So, or yeah, at 60 hertz, right?
Oh, okay, yeah.
So then that would be your data rate.
Gotcha.
It's really that straightforward.
Yeah, I was confused by that.
Is there a particular format you want this in? Just like typed up or?
You know, typing is terrible. So if you can fax it or scan it in, take pictures of it, whatever, and just submit it to Canvas. Because typing it up is terrible, because there's some of the stuff you want to show your work just in case you went error it some way, and you know there could be partial credits. So. And this class is pretty small, so grading is not that big a deal. Nothing else?
When we talk end-to-end for satellites, we're talking point-to-point, not point-to-satellite, right?
Correct. Correct. So if you and I were sitting next to each other on sat phones, sending text messages to waste money, how long would it take that data packet to reach me to you? So it's basically round trip time. Nothing else?
For the problem where it's 12 megahertz channel, it's asking how many bits per second can be sent with 8 level signals. Are we assuming that that's a noiseless channel?
Yeah, so there is no noiseless channel in there. I'm just telling you what the sampling rate is. So you're basically going to take the formulas that don't involve noise, and then multiply that by the bits you can fit in that number of samples.
Why aren't all wireless antennas 1 meter long?
Huh?
Why aren't all wireless antennas 0.1 meter long? Like
Well,
Wi-Fi?
Uh-huh.
Why aren't they 0.1 meters long?
Why aren't they?
Yeah, why aren't they all that way then?
So, are you talking about the antenna question? So the antenna question is like a centimeter to, which is 0.01 meters to 5 meters, right? And that doesn't mean that an antenna that isn't half as long or twice as long can't actually get that signal. So antennas can be double or fractional of the right size and still get the signal. They just don't do it as well. So if you wanted to figure out, hey, I have a 2.4 gigahertz system like Wi-Fi, what's the optimal antenna width?
About 0.1.
About 0.1 meters, right?
We're talking.
That's a lot. That's a lot, right? It's a tenth of a yard or so, right? It's a lot. But it could be half that or a quarter of that. Any other ones?
You mentioned in class that there was a difference between subtracting and adding when it comes to.
Yes. So in
didn't
those
specify.
particular problems, I didn't ask one way or the other. So there's two correct answers depending on which way you went.
If you just rounded it.
You gotta be real in that very last one. You better be really careful with the rounding because the answer is a really small number,
Okay.
like extraordinarily small number. So be careful with rounding in the last problem. Anything else? All right, let's talk about, let's jump into the kind of the networking part of the link layer. So far we've only really talked about how to send data bits from one thing to the other. We haven't actually talked about networks, right? So far it's only been 2 computers. So to broach into that, we're gonna still talk about the one computer to the other, and then we'll transition into adding that third computer in. So we have talked about error detection, error correction, but we've kind of just said, okay, if you detect an error, we just retransmit. But we never talked about the mechanism to do that retransmit. So if you were going to design a network, how would you approach a retransmit? You detect an error, right? Regardless of what error correction or error detection scheme you have, you detect an error. How do you retransmit? What are some of the options?
Send a request to the subject.
Yes, so we could send like a NAC, right? Not acknowledged. Your packet is terrible. Please send me another packet. What else could we do? Or is that the only thing we can do? We can do a timeout. So we have two options, right? We're sending a packet across, and this is a time diagram, so A is talking to B, and time is going down. So we send A sends a packet to B, it takes some time to get there, right? And then B does it and says, oh, there's an error, right? So we're going to send a NAC. And then A would presumably, let's say if this was packet 1, A would send packet 1 again, right? So that's one option. Any problems with this?
Performance?
Yeah, we could have a performance problem. Why?
Collisions?
Huh?
Collisions?
Well, we haven't talked about the second, we hadn't added the third computer, so that's
Oh.
presumably we're synced up, we're good to go. We're gonna add a third computer and mess up everything. But until we add that third computer, what's wrong with this?
There could be an error to B A.
Yes, the error could be here. And then B never actually receives a packet. Remember, we're gonna gear up to a real network, and so the network isn't going to be a line in between one computer and the other. Presumably there'll be other devices, right? Or if we were doing wireless, right, it might just be that something gets trampled on. So even if there was a direct path from A to B, it might get stepped on in wireless without even the third computer, right? You can have a leaky microwave. By the way, did you know that microwaves transmit at 2.4 gigahertz, right? So if you have a leaky microwave cooking your hot dog, you can actually kill your entire network in your house. Just push it all offline, right? Because you're just stepping on all the packets with just random noise. So there's a problem with the NAC in that if the transmission goes awry in the network, then B never receives anything, and then A doesn't know anything about sending the packet again. So let's try a different method. Again, A is talking to B, time is down, and A sends a packet to B, and then we are going to have a timeout. That's designated by T, right? And then, so we have a couple scenarios. The first one is, it's a good packet, and we send back an ACK this time. We're going to acknowledge a packet. Everything went well. Okay, what happens if there's an error? What do we do?
Send it back.
Huh?
Send a non.
We could send a NAC. We could. And some protocols actually do that, but usually not very. That'd be up in the transport layer. So we could send a NAC. But the other thing we could do is we could simply not do anything. Right? We could not do anything, and then at the end of our timeout, what do?
Send it again.
We send it again. So if we got an error here and we don't send a NAC, at the end of the timeout, A will send the packet again anyway. So we don't really have to do anything. Now, let's see what happens if we, instead of killing it on an error on reception, we kill it in the network. What happens?
You just get it again later.
Yeah, B just gets it and never knows that the first packet was ever sent in the first place. It just receives a packet. So it all seems good to it. Right? Now let's look at some other little crazy errors that might happen. What if our timeout is too short?
Get double packets.
So we go across with one, right? And then we send the ACK, but the ACK arrives too late. So what happens? Right? We get another packet that goes, one again. And this would send back ACK. Is there any problem with this? Well, so we get an ACK after 1. The problem is if we don't designate what ACK it is, then A may get confused on, because it sent another packet, it receives an ACK here, right? It might think that that was the ACK from this packet, right? And so it could send another one here too, right? Which might be fine, but you might end up with a bunch of ACKs all the way. So generally, ACKs are actually designated 1. So it gets an ACK 1, and then at ACK 1 when it arrives, right, it would actually send this right here, back at 2, and then this would be an ACK 1 again, and this would be an ACK 2. This still functions, right, even though the timeout's too short. Now presumably we're going to need a mechanism to change that timeout, right, but this still functions, even though poorly. Since we're dealing at a low level, we're not dealing with TCP or anything yet, right? This is a very low level protocol. This might be what happens if you put a 110 meter line in your LAN, right? The ACK would happen too soon, or with the timeout would be too soon, right? If it's too, right? So you might end up with some weird stuff that goes on, but it would function, but you just have a bunch of extra packets flowing across it. So what else? The other weird thing that you could have is, because, for instance, if we're dealing with the internet with UDP or something where there's nothing controlled and flows, and we'll get to that later, but you might have an errant packet in the network. For whatever reason, an ACK or a packet arrives really late. So instead of, so you send packet 1 and this ... now you're on like packet 30, right? That it went there, and then all of a sudden, right here, 1 shows up again. That could definitely happen, particularly in complex networks, right? But the timeout actually still functions correct. So if you have sequence numbers that are in here, and for this simple scheme where we're just jumping back and forth, you need a 1-bit sequence number. So you have a 1-bit sequence number that's just flipping on and off as it goes back and forth. Then even things that arrive really, really late or are out of order or something else, that because you're doing an ACK and back and forth, this is called stop and wait, by the way. So that where a packet goes from A to B, and then acknowledgement goes from B to A. And then the second packet goes from A to B, and acknowledgement goes from B to A. And in modern communications, they're really kind of sending data back and forth with each other, and we'll make that more complex. But for right now, let's just think of it as that. Simple ACK and a data packet. And as it's going across, if we have sequence numbers in, for stop and wait, we only need 1-bit sequence number, but if we put bigger sequence numbers in, then we can do all sorts of neat things. So the problem with this is, if you had A to B talking to each other, in a stop and wait protocol, it's liable to be very inefficient. Why would it be inefficient?
Because you're doing a lot of waiting.
Because you're doing a lot of waiting. So imagine you have a network with a high bandwidth delay. So the network is long, the delay is long, and the bandwidth is pretty high, right? So if you're doing that, then your packets likely look like this. Some amount of data stuck on the packet, right? And then this one has to go all the way across, right? And then in our time sequence diagram, comes back again this way, right? With a very skinny acknowledgement. There's hardly anything in that thing. So most of your bandwidth is empty. So we're going to later on have to figure out a way to fix that, right? But for stop and wait, we have a very simple protocol. And this very simple protocol works so long as your bandwidth delay isn't very high. So if you have a low bandwidth network and the delay is very short, then what equivalently happens is that these packets become very large. Because it just takes a long time to put stuff on the network. Your bandwidth is low, or the network is very short. Does everybody get that idea? So if your bandwidth is slow, it takes longer to put data on the network. So if your bandwidth is slow, by the time you're finished putting your packet on the network, it may have already arrived at the other side, at least the beginning parts. Right? So that in effect stretches it out. The other thing that could have happened is the gap is very small. If things are very close together, then the equivalent happens, right? You have a packet that is somewhat near the width of the network, and as we get into designing the networks, choosing packet sizes, we're going to pick packet sizes that do that for very specific reasons. We want our packet size to fill the network from one end to the other. You're going to learn why magically Ethernet packets are 1,500 bytes. Because that happens to be the width of a packet on Ethernet, 100 meters of Ethernet.
We're going to discuss why it's 100 meters?
Yeah. So, and part of it's arbitrary, right? They decided on a length, right? And then because they decided on a length, then the packet sizes are this. So it could be either way. Our packet size is going to be this, or our length is this, or our length is going to be this, or our packet size is this. And so that was the compromise that was made, and that's why Ethernet packets are 1,500, at least on older Ethernet, right? There's larger MTUs in modern Ethernet, but and we'll discover why you can have that in modern Ethernet. So we can, right now, let's just deal with simple stop and wait. We have an acknowledgement this way, or a packet this way, data, and then acknowledgement. Data, and then acknowledgement. And for right now, we're just going to flip-flop. So data 0, acknowledgement 0, data 1, acknowledgement 1. And we can just flip-flop back and forth. And we can solve most issue errors on small networks where you don't have any greatly delayed packets. Now, thinking forward just a little bit, if this is our case, where our bandwidth delay product is high, which is really just the bandwidth times the delay, is a large number, and our packets look like this visually on the network, what would be better?
Acknowledging multiple packets?
Yeah, let's just acknowledge, instead of having 010101, let's put a bigger sequence number in there, and then we can just send packets that look like this. Notice that the delay on the network is the same, right? The acknowledgement arrives, right? So now if you have, oh, that would still be 0. Now if you have D0, D1, D2, D3, D4, D5, and then acknowledgement 0 actually arrives, right? But this is now D6, D7, and so on and so forth. And then right after here, right, you would, because the length is the same, right, you'd have acknowledgement or ACK 1. And then your network would look like this, where you have multiple packets on the network at the same time. That's kind of zooming forward, right? Still, we only have 2 computers talking to each other. We haven't actually talked about putting a third computer in there. So let's put a third computer on it, and then now in the 4th week of class, we're actually going to talk about beginnings of a network. We can now put stuff on a wire or stuff in the air, at least conceptually in our minds, and we know some of the limitations for that. So now let's do it between more than one computer. We're just going to do 3, because that is hard enough for right now. If we're going to do 3 computers, what are our problems?
Identifying the computers.
Yes, we will have to have addressing. For right now, let's just say our addressings are A, B, and C. What's the other problem?
Control. Sharing the bandwidth, I guess, like token ring type of thing.
Yeah, we got to share the bandwidth. We ain't even got to token ring yet, but we're going to go there probably in the next class, or maybe touch on it a little bit today. We're going to have to share the bandwidth. In order to share the bandwidth, what do? How do we do that?
Divide.
Yeah, so the simple one, we divide, right? We have, going back to your homework problem, we have like 6 kilohertz electrical engineering bandwidth. So let's do the very simple thing and say, oh, all these get 2. That would work, right? There are limitations with that. What are some of the limitations?
You have no timing space.
Well, actually, no. So if A, B, and C are going to communicate, then we're going to give A 2 kilohertz, B 2 kilohertz, and C 2 kilohertz, right? Then if you looked at like the bandwidth space, the waveforms, right? They don't overlap with each other. So on a single wire, they could all communicate at the same time.
You're giving less bandwidth to whoever has the.
Yeah.
modem.
So the problem is networks are very bursty. It turns out that when if you look at, study computer talking, it's a lot of talking and then a lot of doing nothing. A lot of talking and then a lot of doing nothing. So effectively, while you had 6, if you had like a bandwidth diagram over time where this is bandwidth and this is, this is time, this is bandwidth, right? And so you have A, B, and C. And so A would like talk at some point, right? And then B not, and then would talk, right? And then B would do something like it would talk and talk and talk. And C, C's just, guys went to sleep, right? Or turned his computer off, whatever. Right? And so if you added these together, right, it's going to be much less than 6 kilohertz worth of bandwidth that you're actually effectively using. Right? While you could have done 12,000 samples per Nyquist, right? You're maybe doing 1,000 on average. Sometimes you're doing none, right? Like right here, you're doing none. And then, let's put something there. And so at this time, you're doing 2/3, right? Because it adds together right here. So it's not very effective because it would be nice, and let's say this was maxed out, right? For their 2 kilohertz. It would be nice when A wanted to transmit that it could transmit all of it. So we could do this, and there are networks that do this. This is frequency division multiplexing. We take our frequency and we divide it amongst the users. Now this is very simple. We're saying, hey, we have 3 computers. We know we're going to have 3 computers, and so we are going to divide it into thirds. We have not even tackled the problem of having a variable number of computers yet. So, but we could do this. This is what radio stations and TV stations look like. This is what old voice communications look like for cell phones. When you used to make a call on your cell phone before it was completely digital, it would when you made the call, it would connect you and then tell you what frequency to transfer to, and you would transfer to that frequency, and then you would have the technically you need 4 kilohertz to transmit voice, but that's what would happen. Right? And then when you hung up the call, it would free it again. But that is frequency division multiplexing. And old GSM networks kind of use that also. What is the other way we could do it?
By time.
Huh? We could do it by time. We could have time division multiplexing. So if we did time division multiplexing,
And the A at the end is just accessing of the line?
huh?
I see FDMA and TDMA, that's access. The A at the end? What is the
Oh
A?
yeah, multiple access. So
It's different.
So when I was the frequency division multiplexing is FDM, and now we're going to do TDM, time division multiplexing, and then we'll talk about we'll have enough time to talk about multiple access as we go through. So that is multiple access comes into the okay. Now we have a variable number of computers. How do we do that, right? So right now we only have 3, right? Instead of dividing it into 2, we're going to say, hey, you can use all 6 kilohertz, right? But you can only use it a third of the time. So now you have like A coming in and it uses all 6 kilohertz, right? And then this is A. And then B will come in and use all 6 kilohertz, right? And then C, remember C was idle, so it doesn't do anything. So let's just put C here. Right, and then A would come in again. Now sometimes it will be idle, and sometimes it won't. Right, but from A, B's, and C's perspective, this is probably a much better network if you are delivering packets. If you're delivering packets better, if you were delivering analog, it would be unacceptable. Why?
Because you'd have a choppy voice.
You'd have a choppy voice, right? So an analog signal requires that the data before it be in conjunction with the data after it, right? We're not condensing anything. And even if we would sort of do that, right, with packets, then the packets with these time spans would have to be very, very short. Otherwise it would be somebody talking, not talking, talking, not talking, not talking, right? It would be choppy. Even if we could put all the information in there, because we had enough bandwidth to fill it, right? Then if you were delivering something in real time, how are you going to uncompress that to make it right? So you'd have to buffer it. So, and we do that in VoIP, right? So now we have to have, before we deliver the next packet, we have to have the other one buffered so that it becomes, and being uncompressed so that it becomes contiguous. But if it's analog, there is nothing. There's nothing you can do. You can't compress it. It's an analog signal, right? And so unless you're doing digital to analog conversion, analog is completely unacceptable to do it that way. So that's why frequency division multiplexing is used analog. And time division multiplexing, in some cases, is better for digital, not all cases. There are some benefits to frequency division multiplexing, is that you have a guaranteed bandwidth in the way that we did it, right? It is 2 kilohertz, right? And how much data you could fit in that in our example. You know, if you had a pretty good signal to noise ratio, you could put quite a bit of information in there, right? But you're in a regular network, the way that we think of networks, unless it's specialized, then time division multiplexing might be better because we get extremely high bandwidth followed by nothing. Now, we can still make this better, right? Notice that C was idle. So if we could figure out a way that C wasn't going to transmit, then A could just start transmitting immediately, right? And effectively get more bandwidth than what they had. So while A, in this scenario, very simple scenario right here, A still only gets, over time, a third of the bandwidth. Right? It gets to transmit at 3 times or the full bandwidth, 6 kilohertz, what we wrote on the board. But over time, it's still only getting 2 kilohertz. Unless we can start taking advantage of things that are transmitting. we can start taking advantage of things that aren't transmitting, then we can actually increase our bandwidth and start looking somewhat like a modern network. So how do we do that? So one of the ways is token. So conceptually, a token ring is, while the network is not in a circle, we visualize it as a network in a circle. And then we have a special packet called a token. And we send that token around the ring. So A sends the token to B sends the token to C, and C sends the token to A. When you receive the token, you can transmit. So, like, let's say A decides it wants to transmit, right? So the token is going to go forward, and it's also going to contain data behind it. So B would receive the token, right? And then if the data was going to B, that would be great. If the data was going to C, then it would just continue on, right? Two different packets. So now if the A didn't want to transmit, it just sends the token along. And then B sends the token and says, hey, I got stuff to transmit, and it can. So if one computer receives the token, and remember the token is a very small packet, so it's not consuming a lot of bandwidth, and it doesn't want to transmit, it can simply send the token off to C. And then when C gets it and wants to transmit, it can transmit now at full bandwidth. And you can just say however long, you get to transmit for however long. And in this type of network, all A, B, and C all receive the data because it's all on the same wire. We have not got to anything that's not on the same wire yet. So this it's called token ring in its instantiation, but more generally, it's a part of multiple access. What's the other way we can do it? Well, let's just do MA part before we do collision detection, right? So he mentioned collision detection, multiple access, CDMA, right? Which is old-fashioned LAN, not quite modern LAN yet, but LAN that you'll find in older businesses probably. And so that is still multiple access, except for that type of multiple access uses randomization. So if you can detect that two people are talking on the network at the same time, then you can simply transmit. When you want to transmit, transmit. Of course, sometimes two things will transmit at the same time. Right? If two things transmit at the same time, we need to come up with a way to fix that. So, without explaining how yet, let's say that if we're on this network and we both A and B talk at the same time, then how do we how just conceptually, not technically, conceptually, how do we detect that?
So back off time, random.
Yes. So you detect that when you talk, somebody else talked at the same time, right? And then we just pick a random number to back off. So however you implement that is up to you, right? There's a lot of testing that goes into what that random number should be. But let's say for right now, it's just between 0 and 1 millisecond. So you pick a truly random number. Remember, everybody's playing fair. Nobody's cheating yet. We haven't got to cheating. So everybody's playing fair. And so if you're playing fair, you pick a random number between 0 and 1, and that becomes a 1/10 of a millisecond multiple to send again. Now, what happens if you have a lot of people on the network?
Storms.
Huh? We ain't got the storms yet.
You're gonna have just a lot of collisions.
You can have a lot of collisions. So, like, let's say we had 100 people on the network, and 100 computers were actually actively using the network. Then, picking a number between 0 and 10 tenths of a millisecond is probably not going to work out for you, right? Because it will be likely that many of the computers that are trying to speak will pick the same number, right? Because you have 100 and you're picking a number between 0 and 10. So what do we do then?
Increase your backup.
Huh?
Increase your
We increase our back off, actually. That's exactly what we do. So normally, you just double your back off time. So, or actually, you don't, yeah, you do double it. So now we go from 0 to 10 to 0 to 20, right? In a chatty network with 100 computers, probably still not going to work out, right? So then you double it again. You don't add 10 this time, you double the 20, right? And you go 0 to 40, and then you go 0 to 80. Pretty soon you're going to be able to transmit. Somebody's going to get through, right? And then you do through experimentation and actually designing this thing, you know, what those initial values should be to try to get the most effective, right? But that is called exponential backoff, right? And that is exactly what Wi-Fi does. It's also what LAN does, a little differently. So in Wi-Fi, you do exponential backoff, but the problem with that is that you might get some people that are rather unlucky and don't get to transmit a long time in a row. So when you have a collision, the people that already had a time in the game don't actually put their number in, right? Everybody gets a chance. So it's, well, the ones that have, as soon as you get to transmit, then your number starts doubling like everything else. The ones that didn't get to transmit have their, like, basically a sinking timer, right? Your sinking timer down so that it becomes very likely to transmit. And that has to happen in Wi-Fi because Wi-Fi can't detect collisions. They have to infer decisions because you can't detect in Wi-Fi collisions. On a LAN, you can detect on a wire. You can detect collisions. You can hear them. And so, because you can hear the collision at the physical level, then you can have a exponential backoff without any of the complications of having to figure it out when you can't hear it.
What do you mean you have to infer collisions?
Huh?
What do you mean you have to infer collisions?
So in Wi-Fi, because you talk like 1,000,000 times what you listen at. So, and we talked about this in class, I think, early on, right? It's the law of squares. So, because you're broadcasting in Wi-Fi in all directions, right? The surface area of the sphere of signal is increasing. The signal is decreasing at a square for distance, right? So it rapidly decreases, being halved and halved and halved and halved and halved, so that where the receiving computer it is such a small noise to listen to at the receiving computer that if the receiving computer is actually transmitting at the same time, it can't possibly hear it. The difference in attenuation versus signal is drastic. So you have to infer it. So there are ways to infer that somebody transmitted, i.e. you transmitted and nobody replied, right? You transmitted and you were expecting a reply, like you were sending to an access point, then you start doing exponential backoffs to because you infer that somebody else also transmitted what you did. But those are all inferences, right? The access point, there's many other things that could happen. The access point could have went offline. You could have gotten too far away, right? There's other things, and so because you're inferring, you also have to take steps that maybe you're not connected, maybe there's something else wrong, right? Where on a LAN, you can simply just hear it. You can hear the collision. So, we can do randomized backoff, whatever that looks like in instantiation. Or we can do token. But that doesn't solve all our problems. If so, the class would be over and we could go on and drink beer.
So next, what is it, coding?
Code division,
Yeah, coding.
Huh?
Coding next, right?
Coding?
Yeah, code division.
We haven't got up to anything complicated yet. So, let's talk about a protocol. Let's talk, because we're going to figure out there might be some issues with our randomized backup. So one of the very first networks used randomized backoff to work, but it's wireless. So basically, it is not a dynamic wireless network. It was to send messages between 5 islands in Hawaii. So you have 5 radio towers, and we're going to use randomized backoff if there's a collision. So now we have five radio towers in Hawaii, and one wants to send. So D sends, right? If everything goes right, it's wireless, so all 5 islands see it. But say like we're transmitting to B, and because it has an address in there, let's just call it B. B says, hey, that was mine, right? And then B can reply. What happens if at the same time C was transmitting and steps on the communication?
They back off. Right.
We have to do back off. How do we know we we need a back off?
Because one of them didn't receive.
Because in this case, B did not acknowledge, right? So B didn't acknowledge, so we have a random back off. Now there's some inherent flaws in this network. What happens if B is just not functioning? Right? Huh? It'd probably just keep trying to send it, right? And send it and send it and send it. And then at some point you're gonna say, okay, B's not working, right? So we do a randomized back off, right? And then we just send again, right? And if there's no acknowledgement, we randomize back off larger this time, and we send again, and eventually we get a packet through. But let's take a look at what those packets look like if we did it this way. So A, B, C, D, and E. D was sending, right? So it sends a packet. And then B stepped on it. So let's say B stepped on it right here. And because there's overlap here, then this part of the transmissions are dead. And then we do a randomized backoff. Remember, B is also doing a randomized backoff. So B does a randomized backoff, it looks like this. And then D does a randomized backoff, it looks like this. But we clip the end of it. And the packets are dead. So then we do a larger randomized backoff, right? So now D looks like this, it got a good number, or B looks like that, and D got a bad number and it's randomized that, and they get a packet through. Is there any way we can improve that?
Can you say like after, because D's getting B's message, so after it gets B's message, it knows that it can send now? So instead of waiting.
Oh yeah, we could listen. We could definitely listen. Particularly if we heard the last little so in this case, D would have heard the last little bit of B right here, right? It would have heard that. So we might be able to take advantage of that. What else can we take advantage of?
The bits that we did hear from the packets that currently code?
Possibly, if they're coded in a way where there are boundaries inside the packet. But normally, the way we've been designing packets so far is talking about it is like we're just going to send a chunk of data, and then up in the application level layer, they're going to put that stuff back together, right? So we'd have to have like packets within packets if we were doing that. And depending on what you're doing, there might be some value in that, but you generally don't want to have your application trying to figure out how to reassemble packets, right? They should be whole when they arrive there. Is there anything else we could do?
Gaps between transmits?
Huh?
Set gaps between transmits.
Well, we can set gaps, and there are networks that do that, and there are good reasons to do that.
But it's wasting bandwidth.
But it's wasting bandwidth. What if we said that packets can only be sent at the beginning, instead of having randomized backoff, we say that packets can only be sent on clear boundaries. So imagine that inside of here, instead of we having this network like this, we have packet slots. So these are timing slots inside our network. That packets can be sent in. And every time you send a packet, it has to be on that boundary. And then instead of having a randomized backoff at just time, we have a randomized backoff at slots. So now D picks a backoff of 1, and so it transmits here. And then B picks a 1 of 4, and it transmits there. Right? So now we're not clipping the edge of packets. Would there be any value in that? Yeah, it turns out, yeah. So the first one was the original Aloha protocol. And because it was clipping packets, if you have network that is transmitted at any kind of regularity at all, the network efficiency in the first method is 18%. You can get 18% of your bandwidth to use to actually transmit data. Everything else is backoffs and collisions. So when we do this, what do you think it goes to? Wild guess. Still not a good number.
30.
Huh? 36. Right? It doubles the efficiency of the network. Still not great, but it did double it so that we can get 36%. So we wonder if we could fix that. So remember, in this particular network, when you wanted to transmit data, you just transmit. Right? And then if you don't get an ACK, then you say, okay, there was a collision, I have a randomized backup. Is there any other improvement we could do to that?
I thought there was a way that they listen first to see if
Oh,
they,
yes.
like push to talk type of thing.
Yes. So we could just simply listen first.
Then transmit.
We can listen first. Is anybody talking on the network? Notice that if we divide this thing into slots, that is now possible. So it wasn't guaranteed with the first way, because when D was talking, there's a distance between here. And while you're traveling at the speed of light to get to B, it is perfectly possible that D could listen, because there's no boundaries, say there's nothing on the wire, right? So I start transmitting, and then B does the exact same thing very near to D, right? And also starts transmitting. So even though D started first, the first bits have not reached B yet, and so B starts transmitting again, and they still step on each other. Now that we have clear boundaries, though, is there a way that we could use those boundaries so that we could listen to see if anything was on the network before we transmit?
You can assign each antenna a slot, a dedicated slot.
Well, we could do frequency division multiplexing again, but we wanted to have full bandwidth. So what do? What if we make our packets as long as the longest distance from each? So this is the islands in Hawaii, right? What if our packets are at least this long? Now, it doesn't change the fact that D can start transmitting, right? And then as it's going across the network, B starts transmitting again in our original network. But if we do packet boundaries, right, then if B listens here right before it transmits and there's nothing transmitted, nothing else can possibly be transmitting. Right, unless somebody picked the exact same frame to transmit. So there is the possibility that, hey, there's this frame coming off, but it would actually really help our exponential back off now, because if we know that there was a collision, then we can't accidentally step in the middle of any packets. So if we listen to the wire, just listen to the network, in this case it's the air, right, then we could get a further improvement. If we are listening to a wire, we can actually get a great improvement. Now let's put that in with the idea that I don't know if I want to jump into that. We'll jump into classic Ethernet. There's no way we can fit classic Ethernet in 5 minutes. So this is the beginning of, so this is a wireless network. This was Aloha 2. So the first one was Aloha. It's not important that you remember the name. It's not gonna be any test questions or anything on it, right? So, but the idea was, hey, let's just transmit. But we had this real randomized back off. The next, and it had 18% network efficiency because you're clipping the edges of packets. Right, the next one had 36% efficiency because we said, hey, packets can only be done in these certain windows. Right, so packets would have to be getting at these certain windows. We got an improvement. The next improvement I proposed to you, and we'll talk at why it actually makes sense, is that we simply listen prior to transmitting. And while there is an improvement in wireless, there is a great improvement in wired. And the great improvement in wired is because we can hear the collision. We don't have to wait for an acknowledgement. We can hear the collision. All right? And you can hear it just simply because you can listen and talk at the same time. And so on Wednesday, we will talk about classic Ethernet. And we will be able to build actual networks with variable number of computers. All right?